The root cellar had collapsed sometime during the winter, and nobody had bothered to fix it because nobody had bothered to care. The Whitfield family had stopped thinking about the back 40 the way people stop thinking about things they have already decided to leave behind. The shale ceiling had fractured along its bedding plane and dropped 6 tons of flat gray stone onto shelves that once held potatoes and jars of preserved beans, and the quiet hope of families who believed that preparation could defeat winter. But what the collapse revealed was something else entirely. The spring. The shale had been holding back a layer of groundwater that now seeped through the broken rock and collected in the remains of the cellar. A steady cold, a constant flow. Water that ran at 44 degrees year-round and produced approximately 2 gallons per hour, which is not enough for a creek, but is more than enough for a purpose that nobody in that valley had thought of yet. Because nobody had been standing in a collapsed root cellar in February looking at cold water running across broken stone and thinking about what cold water does. Nobody, except 2 sisters who had just buried their parents and inherited the only piece of land that nobody else wanted. Elara Whitfield was 26 years old on the day the lawyer read the will. She stood in the front parlor of what had been her family home, wearing a black dress she had worn to 2 funerals in 5 days, and she listened to words that would change everything she understood about family and inheritance and the mathematics of grief. Her father, Jasper Whitfield, had died on a Monday. The influenza had taken him in the night, quietly, the way winter takes the last leaves from a tree that has already surrendered to the season. Her mother, Harriet, had followed 5 days later, not from influenza, from something harder to name. From the particular exhaustion that comes when a woman has spent decades building a life with one person and cannot imagine rebuilding it alone. The doctor wrote pneumonia on the death certificate. Elara knew better. She had watched her mother stop eating on the 3rd day after the funeral. She had watched her stop speaking on the 4th. She had watched her close her eyes on the 5th night and simply not open them again. Some people die of illness. Some people die of heartbreak. The certificate does not distinguish between them. Briar Whitfield was 22 years old, and she sat beside her sister in the parlor with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the lawyer's shoulder. She had not spoken more than a dozen words since the 2nd funeral. She had not cried since the 1st. She had simply retreated to some interior place where grief could not follow, and Elara did not know how to bring her back. The lawyer's name was Mr. Aldwin, and he was 63 years old, and had been reading wills in that county for 31 of those years. He had learned to deliver bad news the way a surgeon learns to cut, quickly, cleanly, without unnecessary hesitation. The main house went to Malcolm Gentry. The good farmland went to Malcolm Gentry. The livestock, the equipment, the savings account at the bank, all of it went to Malcolm Gentry, who was their father's cousin, and who had visited the family perhaps 6 times in Elara's entire memory, and who was not present at either funeral because the roads had been bad, and he had sent a letter of condolence instead. To Elara and Briar, their father had left the back 40 acres of rocky upland pasture that had never produced a profitable crop, a collapsed root cellar that had been abandoned for years, a spring that nobody had asked for, and a small cabin at the edge of the property that had last been occupied by a hired hand who had quit because the isolation made him hear voices. Ilara felt Briar's hand close around hers beneath the folds of their black dresses. The grip was tight, almost painful, but Ilara did not pull away. She understood that her sister was holding on to the only solid thing left in a world that had become entirely uncertain. Malcolm Gentry arrived 3 days after the will was read. He was 45 years old, with the broad shoulders and soft hands of a man who managed other people's labor rather than performing his own. He walked through the house that had belonged to his cousin, touching the furniture, opening the cabinets, calculating the value of things the way a butcher calculates the weight of meat. He found the sisters in the kitchen, packing the personal items they had been permitted to take: their mother's sewing basket, their father's pipe, a quilt that their grandmother had made from scraps of fabric that told the story of 3 generations of Whitfield women, and a leather journal that had belonged to their grandmother on their mother's side, a woman named Rowena, who had come from Cornwall and who had written down everything she knew about keeping food fresh in a world before ice was delivered in blocks. Malcolm stood in the doorway and watched them pack, and when Ilara looked up and met his eyes, he said the words that would echo in her memory for the rest of her life. "You could sell the back 40 for $50, maybe 60 if you find someone desperate. Or you could come back here and work for me. I will need someone to cook and clean and manage the household. Family should take care of family." Ilara did not answer. She did not trust herself to speak without saying something that could not be unsaid. She simply continued packing, her hands steady, her jaw tight, her eyes burning with a fury that she kept carefully hidden behind the mask of mourning. Briar, however, looked up from the sewing basket she had been holding against her chest like a child holds a beloved toy, and she spoke for the first time in 3 days. "We will take the back 40, and we will never work for you." Her voice was quiet, almost gentle, but there was something in it that made Malcolm take a step backward, and Ilara realized in that moment that her sister had not retreated into grief after all. She had retreated into something else, something harder, something that had been forged in the fire of loss and had emerged as steel. They moved to the cabin on the back 40 on the first day of February. Their father had been dead for 18 days. Their mother had been dead for 13. And everything they owned in the world fit into a single wagon pulled by a mule that Malcolm had grudgingly allowed them to keep because he did not want the trouble of feeding it through the winter. The cabin was 12 feet by 16 feet, with a single room that served as kitchen and bedroom and everything else. The roof leaked in 2 places. The door did not close properly. The fireplace had not been cleaned in years and filled the room with smoke every time they tried to build a fire. But it was theirs. And in a world that had taken everything else, ownership of something, anything, even something broken and leaking and filled with smoke, felt like the beginning of something new. The dog came with them. His name was Ember, and he was a hound with fur the color of autumn leaves and eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should understand. He had been their father's dog, and when Jasper died, Ember had refused to eat for 4 days. When Harriet died, he had howled through the night, a sound so mournful that the neighbors half a mile away had closed their windows against it. Malcolm had tried to keep Ember at the main house. The dog had bitten him on the hand, drawn blood, and then walked out the door and down the road toward the back 40. Toward the sisters. Toward the only family he had left. Ilara and Briar did not discuss the back 40 for the first week. They were too busy surviving, fixing the roof, cleaning the fireplace, gathering enough firewood to keep from freezing. Learning the particular rhythms of a life that depended on their own labor and nothing else. The first night in the cabin, Ilara lay awake listening to the wind push through the gaps in the walls, and the soft breathing of her sister beside her, and the occasional shifting of Ember on the floor near the door. The fireplace smoked badly, and she had to leave the window cracked to keep the air breathable, which meant the cold crept in along the floorboards and settled over the bed like a second blanket made of ice. She thought about the main house, about the kitchen where her mother had taught her to bake bread, about the parlor where her father had read aloud from the newspaper every evening while Harriet mended clothes and Briar sketched in her notebook and Ember dozed by the fire, about the garden where Harriet had grown tomatoes and herbs, and the particular kind of contentment that comes from watching things you planted push through the soil and reach for the sun. All of it belonged to Malcolm now, a man who had sent a letter instead of attending a funeral, a man who had calculated the value of her mother's china before the flowers on her grave had wilted. Ilara pressed her face into the thin pillow and breathed through her teeth and told herself that anger was a luxury she could not afford. Not yet. Not until she had something to stand on that was more solid than fury. It was Briar who found the spring. She had gone walking on a Sunday afternoon with Ember trotting beside her, and her grandmother's journal tucked under her arm. She had not told Ilara where she was going or why. She had simply needed to move, to breathe air that did not smell like smoke and grief, to see something other than the 4 walls that had become their entire world. The collapsed cellar was a depression in the hillside, 8 feet across, the remains of stone walls still visible beneath the fallen shale, and running through the rubble, catching the winter sunlight and throwing it back in tiny fragments of light, was a stream of water so clear that it seemed to have no color at all. Briar knelt at the edge of the depression. She cupped her hands and dipped them into the water and brought it to her lips. The cold hit her like a physical force. 44 degrees, cold enough to numb her fingers in the time it took to lift the water to her mouth. Cold enough to make her gasp. Cold enough to make her remember something her grandmother had written in the journal. Something she had read 100 times without understanding. Water that stays cold in summer is worth more than gold. In Cornwall, we kept fish fresh for a month with nothing but a spring like this. The earth knows how to preserve what matters. You just have to listen. Briar sat back on her heels and looked at the water running through the rubble. Ember sat beside her, his ears pricked forward, his nose working the air the way it did when he detected something that interested him. The water made a soft sound as it moved across the stones, not quite a trickle, and not quite a whisper, but something in between. Something that sounded like patience. And for the first time since her parents died, Briar felt something other than grief. She felt possibility. She ran back to the cabin. She did not stop to catch her breath. She did not stop to explain. She simply grabbed Elara by the arm and pulled her out the door and up the hill toward the collapsed cellar, talking the whole way in a voice that cracked and broke and rose again like a bird learning to fly. Elara stood at the edge of the depression and looked at the water and did not understand. It was a spring. Every farm in the valley had springs. They were useful for drinking water and washing clothes and keeping milk cool for a day or two in summer. They were not worth getting excited about. They were not worth running half a mile in February to see. But then Briar opened the journal and read the words their grandmother had written decades ago. And Elara began to understand. 44 degrees keeps butter fresh for 2 weeks instead of 2 days. 44 degrees keeps milk sweet for 5 days instead of 1. 44 degrees ages cheese slowly and evenly. 44 degrees preserves meat without salt, without smoke, without ice. 44 degrees does everything that money does, except it does it for free. Elara knelt and put her hand in the water. She held it there until her fingers ached with cold. And then she looked up at her sister, at this quiet girl who had not spoken for 3 days and then had not stopped speaking for 3 minutes. And she said the words that began everything. We need to clear this rubble. We need to build this into something. And we need to do it before summer. The way she said it, the word summer landed like a stone dropped into still water. It gave them a deadline. It gave them a clock that would tick whether they were ready or not. They started work the next morning. The labor was harder than anything Elara had ever done, harder than helping with harvest, harder than washing laundry by hand, harder than the endless, exhausting work of keeping a household running. Because this was not maintenance. This was creation. And creation requires a different kind of strength. They lifted shale slabs by hand, each one flat and heavy and cold, and stacked them on the hillside above the depression in rows that Elara planned to use for wall building. They shoveled loose rock and mud into a wheelbarrow that Elara had taken from the main house before Malcolm arrived. She had not asked permission. She had decided that a wheelbarrow was included in the concept of a 40-acre inheritance, the same way wheels are included in the concept of a wagon. 2 weeks of work. 2 weeks of blistered hands and aching backs, and muscles that screamed for rest. 2 weeks of falling into bed at night so exhausted that sleep came instantly, and dreams did not come at all. The blisters came first on Elara's palms, then on the pads of her fingers, then on the heels of her hands, where she gripped the edges of the shale slabs. They filled with fluid and broke, and filled again, and broke again, until the skin beneath them hardened into something that was no longer soft enough to blister. Briar's hands followed the same progression 2 days behind, because she was smaller and her grip was weaker, and she had to make 3 trips for every 2 of Elara's. But she did not complain. Not once. She simply wrapped her hands in strips torn from an old petticoat and kept lifting. It was the 8th day when Briar found the jars. They were buried under a layer of collapsed shale, protected by a wooden shelf that had partially survived the cave-in. 12 jars of preserved vegetables, sealed with wax, dated from the last harvest before the family abandoned the property. But that was not what made Briar cry. Inside one of the jars, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, was a letter. The paper was yellowed and fragile, the ink faded but still legible, and the handwriting was their grandmother's. The letter was addressed to nobody and everybody. It was the kind of letter that old women write when they know they are dying and want to leave something behind that is more permanent than memory. "My dears," the letter began, "I am writing this because I will not live to tell you in person. The doctor says my heart is failing, and I believe him because I can feel it slowing down the way a clock slows when the spring begins to unwind. I want you to know about this spring. I found it the summer the drought killed everything that could be killed. I was walking the back 40 looking for any source of water that might save our garden, and I found this place, this cellar that someone had dug into the hillside, this spring that ran cold even in the worst of it. I told no one. I kept it as my secret because some things are too valuable to share until the right person comes along to receive them. But now I am dying, and secrets die with the people who keep them. So I am writing this down and hiding it here, in the place where I found it, hoping that someday someone who needs it will find it too. This spring runs at 44 degrees. I know because I measured it with a thermometer I borrowed from the doctor and never returned. 44 degrees in January, 44 degrees in July. The earth holds the cold the way a mother holds a child, constant, unshakable, permanent. In Cornwall, where I was born, we called these springs life keepers because they kept things alive that would otherwise die. Butter, cheese, milk, meat, hope. Build something here. Build it strong. Build it to last. And when the world tries to take everything from you, remember that this place will give it back. Your loving grandmother, Rowena. Briar read the letter aloud while Ilara stood in the half-cleared cellar with shale dust on her hands and tears running down her cheeks. And when Briar finished reading, she folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the oilcloth and looked at her sister with eyes that had finally stopped being empty. She knew, Briar said. She knew what this place could be, and she left it for us. Ilara wiped her face with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of dust across her cheeks. Then we had better build something worthy of her faith. They worked faster after that, with more purpose, with the certainty that comes from knowing you are not alone, even when everyone who loved you is gone. By the end of February, they had cleared the rubble and exposed the original cellar floor, which was packed clay and still level and still solid beneath years of debris. The clay was so dense and so hard that the shale had dented it, but not broken it. A foundation that time had tested and found worthy. The spring emerged from a crack in the back wall, where the shale had separated from the sandstone beneath it. The water ran across the floor in a shallow sheet and out through the front of the depression where the original cellar entrance had been. A gentle, constant flow that caught the March sunlight and threw tiny flickers of light across the clay walls. Ilara widened the entrance. She cleared the drainage channel, digging it 3 inches deep so the water would follow the channel instead of spreading across the whole floor. She leveled the floor with a rake and tamped it with her boots until it was flat enough to set a jar on without it tipping. 8 feet by 10 feet, 4 feet deep into the hillside. A constant flow of 44-degree water running across the floor from back to front. Air that held steady at 46 degrees, regardless of what the temperature was doing outside. They had a room. Now they needed to make it something more. Ilara rebuilt the walls first. She stacked the salvaged shale slabs into walls on either side of the depression, raising them to 4 feet. And she roofed the chamber with chestnut poles and cedar shakes, the same way she had seen her father roof a livestock shelter years ago. Poles across the top, shakes overlapping, the pitch angled to shed rain. The roof was low, 5 feet at the peak, but the chamber was not for standing in. It was for storing in. She built shelves, flat shale slabs set on stacked stone supports, 3 levels on each side wall, each shelf 12 inches wide and 8 feet long. The lowest at 18 inches, the middle at 30, the top at 42. The water flowed between the shelf supports and out the front entrance without touching anything on the shelves. But the cold it carried filled the chamber with air that stayed constant regardless of the season outside. Briar watched her sister work and understood something she had never understood before. Ilara was not the practical one because she lacked imagination. Ilara was the practical one because she knew how to turn imagination into reality. She could see a pile of broken stone and envision shelves. She could see a leaking roof and envision a structure that would stand for decades. She could see nothing and make it into something. It was a gift. And until this moment, Briar had not recognized it as such. If you are finding yourself drawn into this story, you are not alone. This is just the beginning. What Ilara and Briar built next would change not just their lives, but the lives of everyone in the valley. Stay with me, because the people who are about to enter this story will test everything these sisters believe about themselves and each other. That night, after Briar had fallen asleep on the narrow bed in the cabin, Ilara sat on the doorstep with Ember beside her and the letter from Rowena in her hands. She read it again by the light of a candle she had set on the step, shielding the flame with her body against the February wind. And for the first time since her parents died, Ilara cried in a way she had not allowed herself to cry before. Not the controlled tears at the funerals, not the silent wetness that had leaked from her eyes when the lawyer read the will. This was something deeper, something that came from the place where fear lives when it has been held down too long. She was afraid, not of the cold, not of the work, not of Malcolm or the empty pantry or the leaking roof. She was afraid of failing, afraid that the strength she projected for Briar's sake was nothing more than performance, afraid that she would pour everything she had into this spring and this cellar and this impossible idea, and it would not be enough. Afraid that the faith Rowena had placed in someone who did not yet exist would be wasted on a woman who was not smart enough or strong enough or brave enough to deserve it. She thought about what Malcolm had said. Family should take care of family. And she wondered if he was right in a way he had not intended. Perhaps family taking care of family did not mean cooking and cleaning for a man who saw her as labor. Perhaps it meant building something that would take care of Briar, that would take care of both of them, that would take care of people they had not yet met. Perhaps it meant being terrified and doing it anyway. Ember pressed his head against her thigh. His fur was warm against her cold skin, and his breathing was slow and steady and completely unconcerned with the uncertainties of human existence. He did not know about inheritance or loss or the particular weight of being trusted with something valuable by someone who is no longer alive to see what you do with it. He only knew that Alara was sitting in the cold, and that she should not be sitting in the cold alone. She placed her hand on his head and felt the warmth of him and the solidness of him and the simple animal loyalty that asked nothing in return except proximity. Tomorrow, she would plan the shelves. Tomorrow, she would begin figuring out how to make this chamber hold not just cold air, but the food of families who did not yet know they needed her. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of turning a collapsed cellar and a trickle of cold water into something that could sustain two orphaned sisters through a world that had decided they were not worth sustaining. But tonight, she would sit here with her grandmother's letter and her father's dog, and the sound of her sister breathing in the cabin behind her, and she would allow herself to be afraid. Because fear, she had learned in these 18 days since her father closed his eyes and did not open them again, does not prevent you from working. It only prevents you from pretending that the work does not matter. She folded the letter and pressed it against her chest. The paper was cold from the February air, but the words on it were warm, and they would stay warm for as long as she needed them. In the morning, the sun rose over the ridge and found the two sisters already at work, already lifting stone, already building. Ember lay at the edge of the depression, watching them with his copper-colored eyes, his tail occasionally sweeping the frozen ground, his ears alert to sounds that the women could not hear. The spring ran through the rubble beneath their feet. 44 degrees, constant, patient, waiting for someone to understand what cold water does. And someone finally had. The first visitor came on a Saturday morning in late March. Her name was Hazel Stonebriar, and she was 61 years old and had been making butter and cheese on her farm half a mile down the hollow for 38 of those years. She was the kind of woman who could identify the breed of a cow by the taste of its butter, and who considered this not a talent, but a minimum standard of competence. Her hair was steel gray, pulled back from her face in a bun so tight it seemed to lift her eyebrows. Her eyes were the color of slate, and they missed nothing. She had heard from a neighbor, who had heard from another neighbor, who had heard from the mail carrier, that the Whitfield sisters were doing something with the collapsed root cellar on the back 40. The news had traveled the way all news travels in small communities. Not through newspapers, through conversations that happened over fences and at church, and in the general store on Saturday afternoons. Hazel walked up the hill and stood at the entrance of the chamber and looked at the shelves and the cold water running across the floor. And she pressed her hand against the stone wall and felt the 46-degree air. And she stood there for a long moment without speaking. Then she said words that Alara would remember for the rest of her life. "This is better than my spring house." She said it in the tone of a person who was admitting something they did not expect to admit. A person who had spent 38 years building a reputation and who was not entirely happy to discover that two young women with no experience had accidentally surpassed her. Alara said, "Your spring house fluctuates. This does not." Hazel looked at her sharply. "How do you know my spring house fluctuates?" Alara did not hesitate. "Every spring house fluctuates. The water level changes with the rain. The temperature follows the water level. Your butter is soft in August and hard in February." She paused. "This spring comes from below the frost line. The earth holds the cold constant. Our grandmother knew this. She wrote it down." Hazel Stonebriar looked at her for a long time. She was not accustomed to being taught by women half her age. She was not accustomed to being surprised by anything at all. Then she said something that was not a request. It was a test. "Can I store my butter here?" And Alara understood that passing this test would mean more than any advertisement, more than any announcement, more than any amount of talking could ever accomplish. Because Hazel Stonebriar's butter was the best in the county. And if Hazel Stonebriar said the cold storage was better than her spring house, then the cold storage was better than everyone's spring house. 1 cent per pound per week, Alara said. The same rate a commercial ice house would charge. Except we never run out of ice. Hazel nodded once. She did not argue about the price. She did not ask for a discount. She simply accepted because she understood value when she saw it. She came back the next day with 6 pounds of butter in a covered crock and set it on the lowest shelf with the care of a woman placing a child in a cradle. And everything changed. Within a month, 9 women were storing butter and cheese and eggs and apple cider. Each one had a story about the summer before, about the food they had lost and the money that went with it. Alma Dyer had fed 20 rounds of ruined goat cheese to her hogs the previous August and had not stopped thinking about it since. 3 weeks of work and $6 gone in an afternoon because the heat had done what the heat always did to soft cheese left in a warm kitchen. She was the second woman through the door after Hazel, and she set her crock on the shelf with the expression of a person depositing something in a vault they hope will never be robbed. Then Pearl Minnick, who stored eggs in bowls of water, where the 46-degree air kept them viable for 3 weeks instead of 1. Then Rosie Sims, who stored apple cider and swore it tasted better at 46 degrees than at any other temperature, and was willing to pay a cent a jug per week to prove it. Alara charged 1 cent per pound per week for storage, a fee so small that nobody argued it. But it added up, because 9 women storing an average of 12 pounds each produced 18 cents per week, which was more than the back 40 had ever earned for anyone who had owned it, and who had considered the property worthless, which it was until someone collapsed the ceiling and let the cold in. Briar kept the records in a leather-bound ledger she had found in the cabin. Names, dates, weights, payments. The mathematics of survival written in neat columns that grew longer every week. She developed a system of chalk marks on small slate tags tied to each item, identifying the owner and the date stored, and she watched her sister work, and she learned. The expansion began in May, and it nearly killed them. Alara had been watching the crack in the back wall where the spring emerged. She had noticed that the fissure in the shale extended further into the hillside than the original cellar, running at least 12 feet deeper into the rock. Water seeped along its entire length, which meant she could extend the chamber and have cold water running across the full length of the new floor. 12 more feet of storage, 24 more feet of shelving, double the capacity. She started digging on a Monday morning without telling Briar what she planned to do. She told herself it was because Briar would worry. The truth was something less generous. The truth was that Alara had spent her entire life being the one who decided things, and she had not yet learned that deciding things alone is not the same as deciding things well. She dug into the hillside for 3 days, following the crack, widening it with a pickaxe, and clearing the loose shale with her hands. She shored the sides with timber posts she had cut from the chestnut grove behind the cabin. But she was working too fast. She was thinking about the 9 women, and the shelf space that was already running short, and the summer that was coming, and the deadline that nature had set without consulting anyone. On the 4th day, Briar came to the chamber carrying lunch in a tin pail, and found her sister standing waist-deep in the new excavation, swinging the pickaxe at a wall of shale that did not want to move. Alara did not hear her coming. She did not hear the soft warning sound that the stone made before it shifted. She did not hear anything except the rhythm of her own labor until Briar screamed her name. The wall gave way. Not the whole wall. A section the size of a kitchen table separated from the hillside and slid forward in a single slab, bringing with it a cascade of smaller stones and a cloud of dust that filled the excavation like smoke. The slab landed 3 feet from where Alara stood. It landed exactly where Briar had been standing 30 seconds earlier, before she had stepped backward to set down the lunch pail. The silence after the collapse was absolute. Dust hung in the air between them. The spring water continued to flow across the floor as though nothing had happened, because water does not care about the catastrophes of the people who build around it. Briar's face was white. Her hands were shaking. And when she spoke, her voice was not quiet or gentle. It was the voice of a woman who had just watched her sister nearly die in a hole in the ground, less than a year after watching both parents lowered into holes in the ground. "You could have killed me. You could have killed yourself. You are building exactly the way this place collapsed the first time. Too fast, too deep. Too much faith in stone that is already proven it cannot hold." Alara opened her mouth to argue. She wanted to say that the shoring was adequate. She wanted to say that the crack was stable. She wanted to say that they did not have time to be careful, because summer was coming, and the shelves were full, and people were waiting. But the words that came out were different from the words she intended. They were sharp and hard, and they sounded, even to her own ears, like something Malcolm Gentry would say. "I did not survive losing everything just to play it safe. The moment the words left her mouth, she knew they were wrong. Not factually wrong, emotionally wrong. She had used the voice of a person who believes their judgment is more important than other people's safety. She had used the voice of a man who walks through someone else's house, calculating the value of their furniture. Briar did not respond. She set the lunch pail on the ground and turned and walked back toward the cabin without looking back. Ember, who had been lying at the entrance of the chamber, looked at Alara, and then looked at Briar, and then followed Briar, which told Alara everything she needed to know about which sister was in the right. They did not speak that evening. They ate in silence, sitting on opposite sides of the small table in the cabin, the fire crackling between them. Ember lying on the floor with his head between his paws, and his eyes moving from one sister to the other, as though watching a conversation that was happening in a language only he could hear. Alara lay awake that night, staring at the underside of the roof she had repaired 3 months ago, and thinking about the sound the stone had made when it fell. A sound like a door slamming. A sound like finality. A sound like the thing that almost happened but did not, and that would happen next time if she did not change. In the morning, she found Briar sitting at the table with the grandmother's journal open to a page Alara had not read before. A page about shoring, about how Rowena's father had worked in the tin mines of Cornwall and had taught her that the earth will hold you if you hold it first. That you never dig forward until the ground above you is braced. That patience underground is not caution, it is survival. Alara sat down across from her sister. "I am sorry," she said. The words came hard because she was not practiced at saying them. "I was building like Malcolm, deciding things alone and expecting you to accept the consequences." Briar closed the journal and looked at her. "You were building like someone who is afraid the summer will come before we are ready." Alara nodded. "Because it will." "Then we build slower," Briar said. "And we build together. And if the summer comes before we are ready, we serve the people we can serve, and we expand later. A chamber that holds is worth more than a chamber that holds more, and then collapses on everything inside it." It was the longest speech Briar had made since their parents died, and it was the truest thing either of them had said in months. They redesigned the expansion together, shoring first, then digging. Timber braces every 3 feet instead of every 6. Slower, safer. And when it was finished 2 weeks later, the new section was 12 feet deep and solid in a way that the rushed version would never have been. 24 more feet of shelving, double the capacity. Built to hold. Briar had saved the chamber by stopping it from becoming the thing it replaced. It was Briar who brought Garrett Fenn. Garrett Fenn was 43 years old and had been farming hogs on his property 3 miles east of the back 40 for 21 of those years. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders and thick through the arms, with hands that had spent 2 decades doing work that broke lesser men. His face was weathered the way all farmers' faces are weathered, lined and tanned and marked by the particular exhaustion of someone who works from before sunrise until after sunset, and still cannot make the numbers add up. He had been losing 10 to 15% of his meat to spoilage every summer because his smokehouse was not cold enough in the heat, and his spring house was not big enough to hold more than a single side at a time, which meant the rest sat in his kitchen, wrapped in cheesecloth and hope. And hope is not a preservative. He stood at the entrance of the expanded chamber and felt the cold air on his face. 46 degrees when the outside temperature was climbing toward 80. The contrast was so sharp that he took a step back, as though the cold had pushed him physically. And he asked a question that would change everything. "Can I hang meat in here?" "How much meat?" 400 pounds? Ilara looked at the ceiling beams, the chestnut poles she had laid across the top, each one 6 inches in diameter and strong enough to hold a man's weight. She looked at the spring water running across the floor. She said, "I need hooks." Garrett came back the next day with iron hooks and a sledgehammer, and his brother. Rowan Fenn was 39 years old and larger than Garrett by a head, with arms that seemed too big for a man of his size. He was a blacksmith by trade, and he had forged the hooks himself the night before, working until midnight because his brother had asked, and because Rowan had never learned how to say no to family. He drove the hooks into the ceiling beams with strokes so clean that each hook set on the first swing. 20 hooks, each one capable of holding a ham or a shoulder or a side of bacon. Briar watched from the entrance of the chamber, and she noticed something that Ilara did not notice, because Ilara was too busy calculating the weight capacity of each beam. Rowan Fenn kept looking at her. Not staring, not leering, just looking the way a person looks at something they did not expect to find in a place they thought they already knew. The way a person looks at the first warm day after a long winter. Not with hunger, with recognition. She looked away, and then she looked back, and their eyes met for just a moment before Rowan returned to his work and Briar returned to watching. Ember, who had been lying at the entrance of the chamber throughout the construction, lifted his head and wagged his tail once, just once, as though he recognized something that the humans had not yet admitted. Garrett hung his first batch that afternoon. 12 hams, 6 shoulders, 4 sides of bacon, 412 pounds of fresh pork hanging in 46-degree air. No salt required. No smoke required. No prayer required. The meat held for 3 weeks without spoiling. Garrett Fenn, who had been losing $50 a year to summer spoilage, did not lose a single pound. He paid Ilara 2 cents per pound per week for the hanging space. And then he told every hog farmer in the valley that the women on the back 40 had built the only place in the county where meat survived the summer. That moment changed what the spring was worth, because a spring-fed cold storage that serves one woman is a root cellar. A spring-fed cold storage that serves a valley is an infrastructure. But not everyone saw it that way. Cedric Ashworth was 55 years old and owned the general store in town. He had been selling ice blocks during the summer months for 12 years, purchasing them from a company in the nearest city that cut ice from mountain ponds in winter and stored it in sawdust until the heat came. He charged premium prices because he had no competition, because ice was valuable when the world turned warm, because people would pay whatever he asked to keep their food from spoiling. He heard about the cold storage, and he did not like what he heard. He rode out to the back 40 on a Tuesday afternoon, his horse sweating in the warmth, his face red beneath the brim of his hat. He stood at the entrance and counted the number of women and men who were no longer buying his ice. 9, 12, 15, and climbing. He looked at Ilara, who stood in the entrance with her arms crossed and her chin raised and her eyes meeting his without flinching. "This is not sustainable," he said. His voice was loud enough that everyone in the chamber could hear. "You cannot compete with commercial ice. You do not have the capacity. You do not have the infrastructure. You do not have the knowledge." Ilara said nothing. Cedric continued, his voice rising. "You are two orphan girls playing at business. When the summer gets hot, really hot, your little spring will warm up and everything in here will spoil. And then, where will these people be? They will come back to me, because I have ice. Real ice. Ice that you cannot make with a hole in the ground and a trickle of water." Ilara still said nothing. She simply stood there, silent, waiting. Cedric stepped closer. He lowered his voice, but it was not softer. It was harder. "I could buy this land. I could pay you $100 for it, and you could take that money and go somewhere else. Somewhere you belong. Because you do not belong here, running a business like a man. It is not proper. It is not right. And it will not last." Ilara looked at him for a long moment, and then she spoke, and her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the chamber. "You will see." Cedric laughed. It was not a pleasant laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has been dismissed by someone he considers beneath him. "You will see," he repeated, mocking her. "That is all you have to say." Ilara did not respond. She simply stepped aside and gestured toward the entrance, an invitation to leave. Cedric Ashworth rode away that afternoon and told everyone he met that the Whitfield sisters were fools, that their cold storage would fail, that anyone who trusted their food to a hole in the ground deserved what they got. His son Nolan, 23 years old and eager to prove himself as sharp as his father, bet $5 that the cold storage would fail before the end of summer. The doubters multiplied. The town physician, Dr. Ambrose Hale, weighed in with the authority of science. He was 48 years old and had a medical degree and had never been wrong about anything in his life. At least, not that he would admit. "Groundwater cannot maintain a constant temperature," he pronounced to anyone who would listen. "It is basic thermodynamics." He had never visited the cold storage. He did not need to. He had a degree, and degrees did not require site visits. Dorothea Caulfield, wife of the bank president and the wealthiest woman in the county, expressed her opinion over tea with the ladies of the church auxiliary. Poor things. 2 girls alone, trying to run a business without a man to guide them. Someone should help them find suitable husbands. That would solve everything. She meant it kindly. She always meant everything kindly. But kindness wrapped in condescension is not kindness. It is something else entirely. And the sisters heard it all. Every comment, every prediction, every expression of doubt disguised as concern. But they did not argue. They did not defend themselves. They simply continued working, continued expanding, continued serving the women and men who trusted them with their food. Because some things cannot be proven with words. Some things can only be proven with time. A woman named Cora Ballantyne came in October. Cora was 50 years old and had organized every church supper, every barn raising, and every funeral dinner in the valley for 20 years. She was constitutionally incapable of seeing a thing that needed doing and not doing it. Her hair was silver, her hands were work-roughened, and her voice had the particular authority of a woman who has spent her entire life making sure that other people do what they are supposed to do. She brought 11 women from her church group to see the chamber. They stood at the entrance, feeling the cold air press against their faces like a hand held flat against the skin. Steady and firm, and unlike anything the October afternoon had to offer. They looked at the shelves packed with crocks and jars and covered containers. They looked at the hooks holding 400 pounds of meat. They looked at the water running across the floor, clear and unhurried. And they left, having reserved shelf space for the winter. Every one of them. Because Cora Ballantyne did not organize visits. She organized commitments. The following Saturday, Cora organized a work day. 8 women and 4 men spent the morning building a proper stone entrance with a fitted oak door and iron strap hinges that Rowan Fenn forged at his home anvil. Not because anyone asked him to, because he had started finding reasons to visit the back 40 more often than strictly necessary. Cora brought cornbread and pot pie and coffee for the crew. She served it on a plank table she set up beside the entrance, and the workers ate in the cold air drifting from the chamber, and talked about what the storage had done for their summer, and what it would do for their winter, and how many more families would use it in the seasons ahead. The conversation moved easily between people who had not known each other well before this morning, and who would know each other better by the time it ended. Because shared labor has a way of collapsing the distance between strangers that shared words cannot match. Cora said, "A building that serves 17 families deserves a door that does not flap in the wind." And everyone agreed. By the end of the workday, the entrance was stone-framed and oak-doored, and handsome enough that Alara stood back and looked at it and felt something she had not felt since her parents died. Pride in a place that was hers. Malcolm Gentry came in November. He had not visited the back 40 since the day he claimed the main house. He had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone in the county had heard the rumors. About the cold storage, about the families using it, about the money the sisters were earning, about how the worthless land he had dismissed was now worth something. He walked up the hill with the particular gait of a man who is preparing to be surprised, and who is not sure whether the surprise will be pleasant or whether it will require him to revise an opinion he has held comfortably for a long time. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, and the cold hit him in the face like a hand. 46 degrees in November, when the outside air was 41. In summer, the chamber had been a refuge from the heat. Now, in winter, it was warmer than the world outside. The same temperature, the same spring. It did not follow the seasons. It followed something deeper. He looked at the chalkboard beside the door, listing 17 names. He stood there for a long time. Then he said, "I want this land back." Ilara had been watching him from the shadows of the chamber. She stepped forward now, into the light from the doorway. "It is not yours to take." Malcolm turned to face her. His jaw was tight. His hands were clenched. The will was unclear. "The back 40 should have been part of my inheritance. I have consulted with a lawyer. He believes I have a case." Ilara did not flinch. "The will was written by our father. He knew exactly what he was leaving us." Malcolm stepped closer. "Your father was my cousin. His blood is my blood. This land should stay in the family. It is staying in the family. We are his daughters." Malcolm's face reddened. "You are two women alone. You cannot manage property. You cannot run a business. The court will see that. The judge will understand that this land needs a man's hand." Ilara looked at him with eyes that had seen death and loss and cruelty disguised as kindness. She had buried both parents in 1 week. She had been evicted from her childhood home. She had built something from nothing with her own 2 hands, and she was not afraid of Malcolm Gentry. "You will see," she said. The same words she had said to Cedric Ashworth. The same quiet certainty. The same refusal to argue or defend or explain. Malcolm stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out of the chamber, and the oak door swung shut behind him with a sound like a judge's gavel falling. The lawsuit was filed the following month. Malcolm Gentry versus Ilara Whitfield and Briar Whitfield, a claim for ownership of 40 acres of land. The hearing was scheduled for the following autumn, months away. Months to prove that the back 40 belonged to them. Months to build something strong enough to survive whatever came next. That night, Ilara sat alone in the chamber after everyone had gone. The cold air surrounded her, 46 degrees pressing against her skin, and she placed her hands flat on the stone shelf and felt the chill seep through her palms into her bones. The spring made its soft sound in the darkness, that patient whisper of water moving over clay. She had not told Briar about the fear. She had not told anyone. But it was there, sitting in her chest like a stone she could not swallow. The ticking clock of the lawsuit counted toward a courtroom where men in suits would decide whether 2 orphaned women deserved to keep what they had built. A lawyer from the city against whatever lawyer they could afford, which was no lawyer at all, unless someone believed in them enough to work for free. She heard the door open. Briar stepped inside, carrying a candle that threw wavering light across the stone walls. She did not ask why Ilara was sitting alone in the cold. She simply sat down beside her on the clay floor and leaned her shoulder against her sister's shoulder and held the candle between them. "Grandmother left the letter in the jar," Briar said quietly. "She hid it here because she knew someone would need it." She paused. "Father knew Malcolm. He knew what Malcolm would do. Do you think he left something too?" Ilara looked at her sister in the candlelight. Briar's face was older than it had been in January. Not in years, in weight. The weight of grief and labor, and the particular aging that happens when a young woman stops being young because the world requires her to be something else. "I do not know," Ilara said. "But even if he did not, we have what we have built. And that is more than Malcolm can take with a piece of paper." Briar nodded, but her eyes held something that Ilara recognized. Not certainty. Something before certainty. The seed of it. The possibility that their father, like their grandmother, had loved them enough to plan for the worst. They sat together in the cold chamber while the spring ran across the floor between their feet, and the candle burned down to a stub, and Ember's breathing echoed softly from the entrance, where he lay with his chin on his paws, guarding the door the way he had guarded their father's door for years before this. But Malcolm did not wait quietly for the court date. He sent a surveyor to the back 40 without permission. The man spent 3 hours measuring boundaries and taking notes, while Ilara watched from the entrance of the cold storage with her arms crossed and Ember growling softly at her feet. Then Malcolm spread rumors that the sisters were charging unfair prices, that they were taking advantage of their neighbors' desperation. The rumors did not stick. Too many people had experienced the cold storage firsthand. Too many people knew the truth. Then Malcolm made his final move before the hearing. He offered to buy the back 40 for $200, 4 times what he had originally said it was worth. He sent the offer through his lawyer with a letter that said the sisters should accept while they still could. Ilara read the letter and set it on the fire. Briar asked what it said. "Nothing worth remembering," Ilara replied. And they went back to work. Spring came early the following year. By April, the dogwoods were blooming and the temperature was climbing, and the farmers were planting and the women were preserving, and the cold storage was filling with the first products of the new season. 23 families on the chalkboard now. 23 names, representing 100 mouths that depended on 44-degree water to keep their food from becoming poison. And then, one morning, Hazel Stonebriar came up the hill earlier than usual. She did not bring butter. She brought herself and her 61 years of living in this valley, and the particular expression of a woman who has seen something she does not want to see again. She stood at the entrance of the chamber and looked at the sky, which was the wrong color for April. Too bright, too clear, too empty of the clouds that should have been bringing spring rain. Ilara came to stand beside her. "What is it?" Hazel did not look at her. She kept her eyes on the sky. "I have seen this before," she said. "Once, when I was a girl. The spring that came too early and stayed too warm, and the summer that followed it." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was lower, the way people's voices get when they are saying something they wish they did not have to say. "The summer that came after killed everything that could be killed." Ilara looked at the sky. The wrong blue. The dangerous blue. The blue of a sky that has forgotten how to rain. She looked at the chamber behind her, at the stone entrance and the oak door, and the chalkboard with 23 names. At the shelves already half full with the first butter and cheese of the season. At the hooks, waiting for the meat that would come when the hogs were slaughtered. And she understood that everything they had built was about to be tested. Not by Malcolm, not by Cedric, not by a courthouse full of men in suits deciding who deserved to own what. By something older and larger and completely indifferent to the plans of human beings. The world is full of people who will tell you what cannot be done. They speak with authority. They cite experience. They offer their doubts as though doubt were a gift. But the truth is this: doubt is cheap, and certainty is earned. Ilara and Briar were about to learn exactly how much certainty costs. Stay with me. The hardest part is still ahead. The heat came the way silence comes to a house after the last person leaves. Not all at once. Gradually. In layers. First, the mornings lost their cool edge, and the dew stopped forming on the grass before sunrise. Then the afternoons stretched longer and hotter until the air itself seemed to thicken into something that had weight and texture, and the faint smell of dust. Then the evenings stopped bringing relief, and the nights became something to endure rather than rest through, and the whole valley settled into a kind of stillness that felt less like summer and more like a held breath. By the middle of June, the creek that ran through the center of town had slowed to a trickle. By the end of June, it had stopped entirely, leaving behind a bed of dry stones that clicked against each other when the wind blew, which was rarely, because even the wind had given up. The wells began to drop. The pumps worked harder and brought up less, and what they brought tasted of iron and deep earth, the taste of water that has been pulled from places it does not want to leave. The gardens wilted, the corn curled, the tomatoes split on the vine and rotted before they could be picked because the heat cooked them from the inside out. And in kitchens across the valley, food began to die. Butter turned soft, then liquid, then rancid, leaving a smell that clung to the walls and the curtains and the clothes of the women who had made it. Milk soured within hours of being drawn from the cow. Cheese sweated and grew dark patches of mold that spread faster than hands could cut them away. Meat that had been carefully salted and smoked developed a sweetness in its smell that was not sweetness at all, but the beginning of something dangerous, and even the dogs turned away from it. Cedric Ashworth's ice melted. Not slowly, the way ice melts in a normal summer, but rapidly, dramatically. The blocks he had purchased from his supplier and stored carefully in sawdust and shade, simply dissolving into puddles that soaked into the ground and vanished. He sent urgent messages to his supplier, but the supplier had problems of his own. The heat stretched across the region, and everyone needed what no one had. The first case of food poisoning came near the end of June. A child, 7 years old, who had eaten cheese that had sat too long in a warm kitchen. She recovered after 3 days of fever and vomiting. Her parents could not afford ice from Cedric Ashworth. They could not afford ice from anyone. Then a second case. Then a third. Then a fifth. Then a 10th. People in the valley were falling ill, the young and the old and the ones in between who had believed themselves too strong to be brought down by something as ordinary as spoiled food. An elderly man died. The doctor called it gastric fever. Everyone else called it summer. And summer was not finished. The cold storage remained at 46 degrees. Alara and Briar worked from before sunrise until after sunset, managing the influx of families who suddenly discovered that the project they had mocked was the only thing standing between their food and destruction. They expanded again, digging a third section into the hillside, following the spring deeper into the rock, where the water ran colder and the air held steady no matter what the sky was doing above them. They built additional shelves. They hung more hooks. They accepted everything that people brought them, because turning someone away meant watching their food spoil. and watching food spoil meant watching people get sick, and watching people get sick meant watching some of them die. They did not raise their prices. 1 cent per pound per week for shelf space, 2 cents for hanging space. The same rates they had charged from the beginning. The same rates that their grandmother had written about in her journal, in a section that Elara read every night before bed, because it kept her anchored to something larger than profit. Food preservation is not a luxury, Rowena had written. It is a necessity, and necessities should be priced for the people who need them most, not the people who can afford to pay the most. Those words kept Elara focused. They kept her from becoming the thing she hated, the thing that Cedric Ashworth represented, the kind of person who saw other people's suffering as an opportunity. A woman came to the chamber on a night when the heat had not broken even after midnight. Her name was Agnes Fenwick, and she was a widow with 3 small children, and she stood at the entrance of the cold storage with her youngest child in her arms, a boy of perhaps 2 years old, whose skin was hot to the touch and whose eyes were glassy with fever. She had not come to store food. She had no food to store. She had come because she had heard that the water in the chamber ran at 44 degrees, and her son's fever would not break, and she did not know where else to go. Elara was inside, arranging jars on a shelf, when she heard the soft knock on the oak door. She opened it and found Agnes standing in the dark, with the child pressed against her chest, and her other 2 children clinging to her skirts, all of them thin and frightened, and lit by the moon that hung above the valley like a lantern that provided light but no comfort. "Please," Agnes said. The word came out broken, the way words come out when they carry more weight than a single syllable was designed to hold. "His fever will not come down. The well is warm. The creek is dry. Please." Elara stepped aside and let them in. She filled a basin with spring water, 44 degrees, and showed Agnes how to soak cloth in it and press it against the boy's forehead and neck and chest. The cold was sharp enough to make the child gasp and then cry, and then, gradually, quiet, as the fever began to retreat degree by degree from the territory it had claimed in his small body. Briar came from the cabin when she heard the crying. She did not ask questions. She simply heated broth on the fire, broth made from chicken that Garrett Fenn had hung in the cold storage, and that had stayed clean and nourishing while the food in 100 kitchens had turned to poison. She brought the broth to the chamber and fed it to the older children, while Agnes held the youngest and wept silently into his hair. Elara stood at the entrance of the chamber and watched Agnes rock her son, and she thought about her own mother, about the way Harriet had held Elara when she was sick as a child, the way her arms had formed a circle that nothing bad could enter, about how Harriet had stopped eating and stopped speaking and stopped living because the person she had built that circle with was gone. Some circles break when you remove one piece. Some circles hold because the pieces that remain press closer together. Elara looked at Agnes and her 3 children in the cold chamber, and she understood that what she had built was not a business. It was a circle. The boy's fever broke before dawn. Agnes carried him out of the chamber into the first gray light of morning and turned to face Ilara with eyes that were red and swollen and exhausted and grateful in a way that went beyond words. "What do I owe you?" she said. "Nothing," Ilara said. "Come back if you need to." Agnes opened her mouth as though to argue, then closed it. She looked at the chamber one more time, at the stone walls and the cold air drifting from the entrance, and the two women who had built this place with hands that were blistered and scarred and steady. She held her son tighter against her chest and turned and walked down the hill, with her other children following close behind, their small figures growing smaller against the gray light until they vanished into the dawn. She would come back, many times, and she would bring others who had nowhere else to go and nothing to offer except the need to be helped. Nolan Ashworth got sick near the end of July. He was Cedric Ashworth's son, the young man who had bet $5 that the cold storage would fail. He was 23 years old and strong and had never been seriously ill in his life. He believed himself invincible, the way all young men believe themselves invincible, until they discover that the world does not care about their beliefs. He had eaten ham that had been hanging in his father's smokehouse, ham that had been properly cured months ago, but that had been sitting in extreme heat for weeks. Ham that looked fine and smelled mostly fine and tasted only slightly off. He was unconscious by the next morning. Dr. Ambrose Hale, the same physician who had dismissed the cold storage as folklore and hope, stood at Nolan's bedside and shook his head. "The poison is in his blood," he said to Cedric. "His body is fighting it, but the fight is consuming him. He needs clean food, cold water, and rest. Cool rest. If his temperature continues to rise, his organs will fail." Cedric looked at his son, lying pale and sweating on the bed, and felt something he had never felt before. Helplessness. He had money. He had influence. He had the largest store in town and the respect of every businessman in the county. But none of that could lower his son's fever. None of that could clean the poison from his blood. None of that could give him what he needed. Only one thing could. He rode to the back 40 that afternoon. The heat was oppressive, the air so thick it felt like breathing through wool. His horse was lathered with sweat by the time he reached the chamber, and Cedric himself was soaked through his shirt. He dismounted and stood at the stone entrance with the chalkboard listing the families who had trusted the sisters when he had not. He could feel the cold air before he saw anyone. A gentle exhalation from the chamber, carrying the scent of clean water and preserved food. And something else, something that smelled like the opposite of everything outside. He pushed the door open. Ilara stood inside. She turned when she heard the door, and her face showed nothing when she saw who had entered. No surprise, no satisfaction, no anger. Just waiting. Cedric opened his mouth to speak, but the words would not come. He had spent months telling everyone who would listen that this place would fail. He had called the sisters fools. He had offered to buy their land and their dignity and their future. He had bet against them with the certainty of a man who believed his own expertise. And now he needed them. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled too tight. Finally, Cedric spoke. His voice cracked on the first word, and he had to start again. "My son is dying. The doctor says he needs cold, clean food, rest away from the heat. He looked at the shelves and the hanging meat and the water running across the floor. I was wrong. Please help him. Ilara did not respond immediately. She stood very still, looking at the man who had tried to destroy everything she had built. The man who had dismissed her as a foolish girl playing at business. The man who had offered her $100 for land that was now saving lives. And she felt something she had not expected to feel. Anger. Not the cold, controlled anger she had shown when Cedric first came to the chamber months ago. Not the steel-jawed refusal to react that she had practiced until it became a mask she could wear whenever someone tried to diminish her. This was different. This was hot and raw, and it rose from somewhere deep in her chest where she had been storing every insult, every dismissal. Every time a man had looked at her and seen something less than what she was. Orphan girls playing at business. You do not belong here running a business like a man. They will be begging me for ice before August. The words echoed in her skull, and for one terrible, honest moment, she wanted to say the thing that would make it even. The thing that would balance the ledger of humiliation. The thing that rose to her lips with the ease of water finding the lowest ground. Where is your ice now? 4 words. They would have been perfect. They would have been justified. They would have been the kind of poetic justice that stories are built around. The moment when the heroine proves the villain wrong and makes him taste the bitterness he once served to her. But Ilara did not say them. She did not say them because she looked down at her hands and saw the calluses that the shale had built on her palms, and the scars where the stone had cut her, and the dust that had worked itself into the creases of her knuckles and would never fully wash out. These were the hands that had built the chamber. These were the hands that had lifted stone and dug clay and held her grandmother's letter in the candlelight while she wept with fear. And these were the hands of a woman who had read a journal that said, "Kindness is not weakness, and mercy is not surrender. And the measure of a person is not how they treat those who help them, but how they treat those who hurt them." She looked up at Cedric. His face was wet, not from sweat, from something he was trying very hard not to let anyone see. She stepped aside and gestured toward the interior of the chamber. Bring him. Nolan Ashworth spent 5 days in the cold storage. He lay on a pallet that Briar made from clean straw and cotton blankets, positioned near the entrance where the cold air flowed most strongly. Ilara brought him water from the spring, 44 degrees, cold enough to lower his fever degree by degree, the way a river wears down stone, not with force, with patience. Briar brought him broth made from chicken that had been preserved in the cold, clean and nourishing, and free of the poison that had nearly killed him. Cedric stayed with his son for the first 2 days, sleeping on the stone floor beside the pallet, waking every few hours to check his breathing. On the 3rd day, Nolan's fever broke. On the 4th day, he opened his eyes and asked for food. On the 5th day, he walked out of the chamber on his own feet, blinking in the sunlight that hit him like a wall after 5 days of cool darkness. He stopped at the entrance and turned to face Ilara, who had been watching from the shadows. "I bet against you," he said. His voice was hoarse and weak, but there was something in it that had not been there before. Something that sounded like the beginning of a different kind of man. "I bet $5 that this place would fail." Ilara nodded. "I know." Nolan reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn $5 bill. He held it out to her. "You won." Ilara looked at the money, but did not take it. "That is not the bet I want to win," she said. "The bet I want to win is the one where everyone survives the summer. Keep your money. Use it to buy food for someone who cannot afford their own." Nolan stood there for a long moment, the bill still extended. Then he folded it carefully and put it back in his pocket. "I will," he said, "and I will tell everyone what happened here. What you did. Who you are." Ilara shrugged. "Tell them whatever you want. I have work to do." She turned and walked back into the chamber, and the cold air closed around her like something she had earned. The heat broke on a night in late July. It did not end gradually the way most heat waves end. It ended suddenly, dramatically, with a thunderstorm that rolled in from the mountains and dropped 3 inches of rain in 4 hours. The temperature dropped 30 degrees overnight. The creeks began to flow again. The wells began to rise, and the people of the valley began to count their losses. The families who had trusted the sisters, the 23 names on the chalkboard, had lost almost nothing. Their butter had not spoiled. Their meat had not rotted. Their eggs and cheese and milk and cider had survived the worst summer in memory, protected by a spring that held its cold no matter what the calendar said. And the people who had doubted, who had mocked, who had bet against the foolish orphan girls with their hole in the ground and their trickle of water, came to the back 40, one by one, to say words that cost them nothing and meant everything. I was wrong. In the days that followed, they came. Dr. Ambrose Hale stood at the entrance and examined the thermometer that Briar had mounted on the wall. He tapped it with his finger, as though expecting it to change. It did not. The aquifer did not warm, he said, his voice flat, stripped of the authority it had once carried so easily. The temperature remained constant throughout the summer. My understanding requires revision. He did not apologize. He was not the kind of man who apologized. But the admission itself, from a man who had built his identity on never being wrong, was something close enough. Dorothea Caulfield appeared 3 days later in her finest dress, looking entirely out of place among the stone walls and work clothes. She stood at the entrance for a long moment, her gloved hands clasped in front of her, her face struggling with something that looked like pride fighting against honesty. She said she had spoken unkindly. She said her husband's bank would offer a line of credit, no interest for the first year. She said it was the least they could do, and she did not quite meet Ilara's eyes while saying it. Ilara nodded once and thanked her and watched her walk away. And something that had been closed was now, if not open, at least unlocked. But the one who mattered most was Cedric. He came back to the chamber on a morning when the rain was still fresh on the ground, and the valley smelled like wet earth and relief. He did not stand at the entrance this time. He walked all the way inside, to the place where his son had lain on the pallet for 5 days. and he stood there, looking at the empty spot on the floor where Nolan had almost died, and where Nolan had been saved. "I called you fools," he said. "I told everyone you would fail. I offered to buy this land because I believed it was worthless." He paused, and the pause was long enough for the sound of the spring to fill it. "I was wrong about all of it, and I am sorry." Ilara looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something she had not expected to do. Something that surprised her as much as it surprised him. She extended her hand. Cedric looked at her hand, then at her face, and then he took it, and they shook, and something that had been broken was begun. Not repaired, not yet, but begun. But the summer was not the final test. There was still a courtroom. There was still a letter no one had seen. And there was still the question of what happens when you build something so valuable that everyone wants to take it from you. We are almost home. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building that had hosted hundreds of trials over the decades. The walls had heard every kind of human story, and they had absorbed none of it. They simply stood, impassive and permanent, waiting for the next story to be told. The courtroom was crowded on the morning of the hearing. Every seat was taken, and people stood along the walls and in the doorway, straining to hear. Not because land disputes were usually interesting. They were not. They were dry and technical, and concerned with boundaries and the precise language of documents written by men who had been dead for years. But this case was different. This case was about the cold storage, about the 2 sisters who had built something from nothing, about the summer that had taken so much, and the place that had saved so much more. This case was about whether good work could be taken away by bad intentions. Malcolm Gentry sat at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer, a man named Aldrich Pembroke, who had come from the nearest city and who charged more per hour than most farmers earned in a week. Pembroke was 51 years old, with silver hair and a confident voice, and the particular polish that comes from winning more cases than you have lost. Ilara and Breyer sat at the defendant's table with their lawyer, a man named Silas Bridwell, who had been practicing law in the valley for 23 years and who had taken their case for free because he believed in what they had done and because his own mother had stored butter in their chamber throughout the summer and had not lost a single pound. The judge's name was Ephraim Locke. He was 62 years old, and his patience for theatrics was limited. "Proceed," he said to Pembroke. "Make your case." Pembroke stood and positioned himself where everyone could see. "Your Honor, this case is simple. Jasper Whitfield died, leaving behind a will that divided his property. The main house and farmland went to his cousin, Malcolm Gentry. The back 40 went to his daughters. But the will contained an ambiguity, a phrase that could be interpreted in more than one way. The phrase is this." He read from the document. "To my cousin Malcolm, I leave all property that produces income or value." He set the paper down. At the time the will was written, the back 40 produced no income and had no value. But now it does. It produces income. It serves the community. And therefore, according to the language of the will, it should belong to Malcolm Gentry. Judge Locke turned to Bridwell. "Your response?" Bridwell stood slowly. He was not a performer. He did not command a room the way Pembroke did. But he had something else. Your Honor, the plaintiff's interpretation requires us to believe that Jasper Whitfield intended to leave his daughters nothing of value. That he wrote a document designed to ensure that anything they built, anything they created, anything they achieved would be taken from them and given to someone else. He walked to the defendant's table and stood behind Elara and Breyer. Many people in this courtroom knew Jasper Whitfield. He was a man who loved his daughters, who raised them to be strong and capable and independent. Does anyone here believe that such a man would write a will designed to punish his children for succeeding? A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Locke tapped his gavel once. "Continue," he said. Bridwell nodded. "Your Honor, I would like to call a witness, someone who has information that is relevant to this case." Pembroke rose. "Objection! We were not informed of any witness." "The witness came forward only yesterday," Bridwell said. "I apologize for the late notice, but I believe the court will find her testimony essential." Judge Locke considered. "I will allow it. Call your witness." Bridwell turned toward the gallery. "I call Hazel Stonebriar." The murmur grew louder. Hazel rose from her seat in the third row and walked to the witness stand with the measured stride of a woman who had never hurried anywhere in her life and did not intend to start now. She was sworn in and seated, and she looked at the judge with eyes that had seen 61 years of living and were not impressed by any of it. "Mrs. Stonebriar," Bridwell began, "how long did you know Jasper Whitfield?" "Most of my life," Hazel said. "We were neighbors. Our farms shared a property line. I watched his children grow up. He watched mine." "Do you have any knowledge of Jasper Whitfield's intentions regarding the back 40? Hazel reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a folded piece of paper. She held it up for the court to see. "I have this." Pembroke rose. "Objection. We have not had an opportunity to examine this document." Judge Locke extended his hand. "I will examine it myself." Hazel handed the paper to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. Locke unfolded it carefully and read it. His expression did not change. Then he read it again. Then he looked up. "Where did you get this?" "Jasper gave it to me," Hazel said, 3 weeks before he died. He said he wanted someone outside the family to hold it in case there was ever any dispute. Locke looked at Pembroke. "Counsel, approach." Both lawyers went to the bench. Locke showed them the document. Pembroke's face went pale. Bridwell's expression did not change, but Elara noticed that his shoulders relaxed slightly. Locke addressed the courtroom. "This document is a letter written by Jasper Whitfield shortly before his death." He picked up the letter and began to read. "To whoever reads this after I am gone, I am writing this because I know my cousin Malcolm. I know what he will do when he sees the will. He will find a way to interpret it in his favor, because that is what Malcolm does. He sees everything as belonging to him, and he cannot understand why the world does not agree. So let me be clear. The back 40 goes to my daughters. All of it. Forever. Not as a token, not as a gesture, as an inheritance. Malcolm will say that I described the land as worthless. This is true. I did describe it that way. But I did not believe it. I knew about the spring. I have known about it for 30 years, since my mother Rowena told me about it before she died. She found it. She understood what it could be, and she asked me to keep it secret until the right person came along to use it. My daughters are the right people. I am leaving them the spring because I trust them to build something with it. I am leaving Malcolm the house and the farmland because I do not trust him with anything more important. If Malcolm challenges this in court, show the judge this letter, and tell Alara and Briar that their grandmother believed in them before they were born. And so did I. Jasper Whitfield. Locke set the letter down. He looked at Malcolm, who had gone very still at the plaintiff's table. He looked at Alara and Briar, who were holding hands beneath the table the same way they had held hands on the day the first will was read, in the same parlor, wearing the same black dresses, hearing words that changed everything. The language of the will is clear, Locke said, and this letter removes any ambiguity. Jasper Whitfield intended the back 40 to belong to his daughters regardless of its value. The plaintiff's claim is dismissed. He struck his gavel once. The courtroom erupted. People stood and cheered and clapped and called out the sisters' names. Cora Ballantyne pushed through the crowd to embrace them both. Hazel Stonebriar remained in the witness stand, watching with the satisfied expression of a woman who had kept a secret for months and was glad to finally let it go. Malcolm Gentry did not move. He sat at the plaintiff's table while his expensive lawyer gathered his papers and made excuses and prepared to leave. He sat there while the courtroom emptied around him. He sat there while his carefully constructed case crumbled into dust. And then he began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just tears running down his weathered cheeks, his shoulders shaking slightly, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though it were the only thing keeping him from falling. Alara saw him. She had been accepting congratulations, shaking hands, doing all the things that victors do. But she saw Malcolm sitting alone at the plaintiff's table, weeping, and something in her shifted. She walked toward him. Briar called after her, but Alara did not answer. She simply walked to the table and stood there, waiting. Malcolm looked up. His eyes were red. His face was wet. And his expression was not the expression of a man who had lost a lawsuit. It was the expression of a man who had lost something much older and much deeper. "He always loved you more," Malcolm said. His voice was broken. "Jasper, he always loved you more than he loved me. I was his cousin. I was supposed to be like a brother. But he gave you the spring. He gave you the secret. He gave you everything that mattered, and he gave me the house, because he knew I would not know what to do with anything else." Alara stood there for a long moment. She thought about everything Malcolm had done: the eviction, the condescension, the lawsuit, the attempt to take what was not his. And she thought about what her father had written, about trust, about knowing people, about leaving them what they could handle. She reached out and placed her hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "You can use the cold storage," she said, "whenever you need it, free of charge." Malcolm looked at her. His eyes widened. "Why?" he asked. "After everything I did, Why would you do that? Because my father would have wanted it, Ilara said. And because holding on to anger is heavier than letting it go. She turned and walked away. And Malcolm sat there watching her go. And something in his face changed. Something that had been hard became soft. Something that had been closed began slowly to open. He did not accept her offer. He was too proud for that. But he never spoke against the sisters again. And when people asked him about the lawsuit, he said only this: I lost, and I deserved to. The autumn that followed the trial was the quietest season Ilara could remember. Not quiet in the way of emptiness. Quiet in the way of things that have been settled. The kind of quiet that comes after a long argument ends, and the people involved discover that the silence between them is not uncomfortable, but restful. That it has room in it for breathing. The cold storage grew. 23 families became 30. 30 became 35. The chalkboard beside the oak door filled with names until Briar had to erase the smallest handwriting and rewrite everything in tighter columns to make room for the ones still coming. Farmers who had lost meat and milk and months of labor during the summer came to the back 40 with the particular humility of people who have learned something expensive and do not intend to learn it again. Ilara expanded the chamber a fourth time that autumn, following the spring deeper into the hillside, where the rock was harder and the water ran colder, and the air held its temperature with the stubbornness of something that had been doing the same thing for 1,000 years and saw no reason to change. She shored every 3 feet the way Briar had insisted. She tested every beam before she trusted it with weight. She built slowly, and she built well. And she did not dig a single inch further than the timber behind her could hold. Briar kept the books. The ledger had grown thick with entries, each page a record of what the valley produced, and what the valley preserved, and what the valley owed, to a spring that ran at 44 degrees, and 2 women who had turned it into something that mattered. The numbers were small, pennies per pound per week, but pennies accumulate the way water accumulates, slowly and constantly, and without anyone noticing, until the basin is full. Rowan Fenn proposed to Briar on a Sunday afternoon in October. They were walking along the creek that ran through the back 40, the one that had dried to nothing during the summer, and was now running again with the clear, cold water of autumn rain. Ember trotted ahead of them the way he always did, his nose working the air, his tail sweeping back and forth with the steady rhythm of an animal that is content with the direction things are moving. Rowan stopped walking. He turned to face Briar, and he stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides and his mouth slightly open, and the expression of a man who has rehearsed something 100 times and has now forgotten every word of it. I am not good with words, he said finally. I never have been. But I know what I feel, and I know what I want. He paused. His hands were shaking, which was remarkable because these were hands that swung a hammer for a living and had never shaken while doing it. I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to be the person you come home to and the person who comes home to you. He stopped again. He looked at the ground and then at the sky and then at Briar. You do not have to answer now. You do not have to answer ever if you do not want to. But I needed you to know. I needed to say it out loud so it would be real." Briar looked at him, at this large, gentle man who had forged hooks and built doors and found reasons to visit every Saturday for months. At this man who had never once tried to tell her what she should do or who she should be. At this man who was offering her everything without asking for anything in return, except the chance to stand beside her. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She simply took his hand and held it. And they stood there together while the creek ran past their feet, and the October light turned the trees along the ridge to copper and gold. An ember sat at their ankles, watching them with the patient expression of an animal who has been waiting for this particular moment for quite some time. She said yes 3 weeks later. Ilara was the first to know. The wedding was held at the church in the spring. Cora Ballantyne organized the reception because Cora Ballantyne organized everything, and would have been personally offended if anyone had suggested otherwise. Hazel Stonebriar provided the food, which meant the food was excellent because Hazel did not know how to provide anything less. Half the county attended because Rowan was well liked and Briar was well respected, and because everyone wanted to see something beautiful after a season of so much loss. Ilara stood beside her sister as the ceremony began. She wore a dress that Briar had sewn for her from fabric they had bought with money the cold storage had earned, and she held a small bouquet of wildflowers that she had picked that morning from the meadow behind the cabin. Ember lay at the foot of the altar, technically not permitted inside the church, but allowed by special arrangement with the pastor, because the dog had been part of the family longer than most of the congregation had been part of the town. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Rowan kissed Briar with the careful tenderness of a man who cannot quite believe his luck, Ilara felt tears running down her cheeks, and she did not wipe them away. Because some tears are not about sadness. Some tears are about joy so fierce that the body cannot hold it all inside and has to let some of it escape through the eyes. And some tears are about the people who are not there to see the moment, but who made the moment possible by the lives they lived and the things they left behind. Ilara cried for her sister's happiness, and she cried for her parents who would have loved this day. And she cried for Rowena, who had hidden a letter in a jar in a collapsed cellar and trusted the future to find it. The years passed the way years pass when they are filled with purpose, not quickly and not slowly, but steadily, the way the spring ran through the chamber, constant and patient and unimpressed by the calendar. The cold storage served 35 families, then 42, then 50. Ilara expanded the chamber 3 more times, each time following the spring deeper into the hillside, each time building with the careful patience that Briar had taught her on the day the wall collapsed and nearly killed them both. By the time the shelves stopped growing, the cold storage was the largest private food preservation facility in the county, serving families from the town and the surrounding hollows and the farms that stretched along the valley floor for miles in either direction. Briar and Rowan had 3 children, 2 boys who grew tall and quiet like their father, and a girl they named Rowena, after the grandmother who had started everything by writing down what she knew about cold water and preservation and the things that matter. Elara watched her niece grow and saw in her the same careful attention that Briar had shown from the beginning, the same habit of watching before speaking, the same ability to see what other people missed. The child would sit at the entrance of the cold storage for hours, watching the water run across the floor, asking questions about temperature and flow, and the particular properties of shale that made it hold cold the way other stones did not. "She is going to understand this place better than any of us," Elara told Briar one evening. "She asks the right questions." "She asks your questions," Briar said, "the ones about building. And she asks my questions, the ones about keeping records. But she also asks questions neither of us thought to ask." "What kind?" "The kind about what happens next, about who this place serves after we are gone." Elara looked at her sister and recognized something she had not seen before. Briar was not just keeping books. She was keeping a legacy. Writing down not just the numbers, but the methods, the principles, the reasoning behind every decision they had made. A journal of her own, companion to Rowena's, that would tell the next generation not just what to do, but why. Elara met a man some years after the trial. His name was Edmund Calloway, and he was a school teacher who had come to the valley to teach mathematics at the new school that had been built with money donated by families who had prospered because their food had not spoiled during the summer that nearly ruined everyone else. He was quiet and thoughtful, and he understood numbers the way Elara understood stone and water. They married and built a house on the back 40, close enough to the cold storage to walk there in 5 minutes, far enough away that the sound of the spring did not keep them awake at night. It was a Tuesday evening when Elara first spoke about giving it away. She and Briar were sitting on the porch of the cabin that had once been their entire world, and was now just a place they visited sometimes when they wanted to remember what it felt like to have nothing, and to build from nothing, and to discover that nothing is not the same as empty. The cabin was used for storage now. Tools and extra timber and the things that accumulate when a life expands beyond the boundaries of its first small room. Elara's hair had threads of gray in it. Her hands were still strong, but the knuckles ached in cold weather, and the scars from the shale had faded from red to white. She sat in a chair that Rowan had built for her, and she looked out at the hillside, where the stone entrance and the oak door stood in the evening light, solid and handsome, and worn smooth by the hands of hundreds of people who had opened and closed it over the years. "We built something," she said. Briar nodded. "We did, but it is not ours anymore." Briar looked at her sister. The evening light caught the silver in her hair and the lines around her eyes, and the particular expression of a woman who has been thinking the same thought and waiting for someone else to say it first. "It belongs to all of them," Elara continued. "The families who use it, the community that depends on it. Keeping it feels like holding on to something that wants to be free." Briar was quiet for a long time. The sounds of the valley drifted up to them, a dog barking somewhere, children calling to each other in the distance, the faint clatter of someone closing a gate. "What are you suggesting?" Briar asked, though she already knew. Elara turned to face her sister, the same sister who had not spoken for 3 days after their parents died, and then had spoken the words that changed everything. The same sister who had found the spring and read the letter and stopped the wall from collapsing and kept the books and married the blacksmith and named her daughter after the woman who started it all. "I am suggesting we give it back," Ilara said. They announced the decision at the church on the first Sunday of the following month. The cold storage would no longer belong to the Whitfield sisters. It would belong to the community. Every family that used it would have an equal share in its operation. Decisions would be made collectively. The spring that Rowena had found decades ago would continue to serve the people who needed it, but it would serve them as owners, not as customers. Cora Ballantyne cried. She was old now, her silver hair gone white, her work-roughened hands slower than they had been, but still capable of organizing anything that needed organizing, which was everything. "You are giving it away," she said to Ilara after the service. "Everything you built. Everything you worked for. You are just giving it away." Ilara shook her head. "I am not giving it away. I am giving it back. It was never really mine. It was always the community's. I was just taking care of it until they were ready to take care of it themselves." Cora wiped her eyes. "Your grandmother would be proud." Ilara smiled. "I know. That is why I am doing it." The transfer was completed on a Saturday in June. 53 families signed the documents that made them equal owners of the community cold storage. The ceremony was held at the chamber itself, with tables set up on the hillside and food provided by the families who had been storing their butter and cheese and meat here for years. Food that had survived every summer since the sisters first cleared the rubble and let the cold in. Ilara stood at the stone entrance with the oak door open behind her and looked out at the faces of people she had known for half her life. People who had doubted her and supported her and used her cold storage and told their neighbors about it. People who had become her community in the truest sense of the word. Not people who lived near her, people who depended on her and whom she depended on in return. She did not give a speech. She was not the kind of person who gave speeches. She simply said the only words that mattered. "Take care of it. That is all I ask." And then she stepped away from the entrance and let the crowd move past her into the chamber where the cold air waited, and the spring still ran, and the shelves still held, and the hooks still hung from the ceiling beams that Rowan had set with one swing of his hammer on a summer afternoon that felt like a lifetime ago. Ilara walked to the entrance one last time after the crowd had moved inside. She stood in the doorway and placed her palm flat against the stone wall. The cold seeped through her skin the way it had seeped through her skin on the first day she touched it. That February afternoon when Briar had dragged her up the hill and she had knelt at the edge of the depression and put her hand in water so cold it made her gasp. 46 degrees. The same temperature it had been on that first day. The same temperature it had been during the summer that nearly killed the valley. The same temperature it had been on the night Agnes Fenwick brought her feverish child to the door. The same temperature it would be tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Because the earth does not change its mind about the things it has decided to hold. She kept her hand on the stone for a long moment. She felt the cold move through her palm and into her wrist and up her arm, and she thought about Rowena. who had pressed her own hand against this same stone decades before, and had understood what cold water could do, and had trusted the future to figure out the rest. She thought about her father, who had known the secret and kept it, and left it for his daughters because he believed they were the right people. She thought about Briar, who had found the spring and read the letter and saved the chamber and kept the faith. She thought about Ember, who had followed them to the back 40 on the first day and had never left, and who was buried now beneath a stone near the entrance, with words carved by Rowan's steady hand. The most loyal friend. He was here from the beginning. From inside the chamber, she could hear the sound of the families. Voices overlapping, plates clinking, children laughing, someone telling a story about the summer the ice ran out, and the only cold place in the valley was a hole in the ground that 2 orphan girls had turned into something that saved them all. Alara took her hand off the stone. The cold lingered in her palm for a moment, the ghost of 46 degrees, and then it faded as the warmth of the June afternoon reclaimed her skin. She turned away from the entrance. The hillside stretched before her, green and alive, and dotted with the tables and chairs and people that had gathered to celebrate what she and Briar had built and what they had given back. At the bottom of the hill, the house she shared with Edmund glowed in the late afternoon light, and she could see the garden she had planted that spring, the tomatoes climbing their stakes, the herbs spreading along the border, the particular green of things that are being tended by someone who understands that growing is a form of faith. She walked toward the sound of the people, toward the food and the laughter and the warmth of a community that had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that the things that save us are not always the things we expect. Behind her, through the oak door that Cora's workday had built and Rowan's hinges held, and 100 hands had opened and closed, the spring continued to run. 44 degrees. Across the packed clay floor that Alara had tamped with her boots on a February morning when she was 26 years old and terrified and determined, and holding a letter from a dead woman who had believed in her before she was born. The water did not know about the families eating on the hillside. It did not know about the trial, or the summer, or the man who had cried at the plaintiff's table, or the boy whose fever it had broken, or the woman who had built the walls that held it. Water does not know things. Water only does what water does. It runs. It cools. It holds. And sometimes, if someone is wise enough to listen, and brave enough to build around it, it saves everything that matters. The spring was still running. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone you know, or something you have built, or something you hope to build, consider sharing it. Subscribe if you have not already, and remember that the cold that saves us is not always the cold we expect.